As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So this article is from the New York Times, and this seems like a pretty huge story. This was published on Thursday night, not long before I planned on starting recording this. And I'm just going to read some of it for you. Israeli officials obtained Hamas's battle plan for the October 7th terrorist attack more than a year before it happened, documents, emails, and interviews show. But Israeli military and intelligence officials dismissed the plan as aspirational, considering it too difficult for Hamas to carry out. The approximately 40-page document, which the Israeli authorities codenamed Jericho Wall, outlined point by point exactly the kind of devastating invasion that led to the deaths of about 1,200 people. The documents circulated widely among Israeli military and intelligence leaders, but experts determined that an attack of that scale and ambition was beyond Hamas's capabilities, according to documents and officials. It is unclear whether Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu or other top political leaders saw the document as well. So again, this is really saying something here. I went over a few reports. There was one recently from Haaretz saying that Israeli women in the military who were, watched basically security cameras all day of what's going on in Gaza were issuing all these warnings that were being ignored. And they said that it's a plan designed to start a war, not just a raid on a village. Officials privately concede that had the military taken these warnings seriously and redirected significant reinforcements to the south where Hamas attacked, Israel could have blunted the attacks or possibly even prevented them. Instead, the Israeli military was unprepared as terrorists streamed out of the Gaza Strip. It was the deadliest day in Israel's history. Israeli security officials have already acknowledged that they failed to protect the country, and the government is expected to assemble a commission to study the events leading up to the attack. So this is related to that hostage deal that the U.S. and Iran made not too long ago. Sorry, it's not loading for some reason. Oh, there it goes. Okay, so the House on Thursday passed a bill that would force the president to permanently freeze $6 billion in Iranian funds that were briefly made available to Tehran as part of a prisoner swap deal. Under the deal, the U.S. and Iran exchanged prisoners, and the U.S. allowed the transfer of $6 billion from South Korea to Qatar, where Iran would receive access to the money. But shortly after the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel, the Biden administration decided to go back on the deal and cut off Iran's access to the money. The administration made the move due to claims and pressure from Congress over claims that Iran was involved in the October 7th attack, even though there's no indication that it was. U.S. intelligence, according to media reports, said that Iran was surprised by the Hamas assault. Israel has said it had no evidence of Iranian involvement. That didn't matter to the Republicans in Congress, who just made a huge deal about the $6 billion in Iran's own money that President Biden so graciously allowed them to access. It just goes to show how there's just no thinking among these people. They just want to use every opportunity, use every crisis to advance some sort of agenda. So the bill that was passed by the House on Thursday would make the administration's move to freeze the Iranian funds permanent by requiring sanctions on any foreign entity that moves to make them available for Iran. The legislation passed in a vote of 307 to 119, with 118 Democrats and one Republican, Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky, opposing the bill. So Massie was the only Republican, and 118 Democrats were against it. And they explained their opposition was, the U.S. is saying, Iran could only access the funds for humanitarian spending. Biden did such a great job brokering this deal. That was their argument. But I really like what Massie said, because he explained his opposition in a post on X. And he said, quote, "There's no legal or moral authority for us to freeze or steal assets of other countries we are not at war with. It's also short-sighted for us to use our superpower status to force foreign banks to freeze assets of sovereign countries," end quote. So I really like that, because that's just, we don't have the right to sanction and freeze and steal and take money from other countries. We shouldn't do it. It's just kind of as simple as that, and it's a good principle stance on sanctions. So this article is from the South China Morning Post, and it says that China has confirmed the U.S. and China are working to restore these military communication channels that have been suspended. Many of them were suspended after Nancy Pelosi, when she was the House Speaker, made her very provocative trip to Taiwan last year. And when Biden and President Xi Jinping met recently, They agreed to restart military communication and dialogue. China's basically just confirming it here. This was China's defense ministry. And also, they reiterated a willingness to cooperate on AI, but is warning against military activity near its shores and aid to Taiwan. So the two big things that China's really unhappy with when it comes to the military stuff, of course, is the U.S. giving military aid to Taiwan, which is unprecedented in this era that we're in. The U.S. has sold weapons to Taiwan, but never given them weapons free of charge or financed the purchase as they have been doing now. I think kind of the big question when it comes to these military communications is if Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, is going to have a high-level meeting with a Chinese military official. Right now, their defense ministry position is vacated since they got rid of Li Shangfu, who was under U.S. sanctions, and because of that, and because the U.S. refused to lift the sanctions, China declined a meeting between Li and Austin. So
here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
World economy will slow next year because of inflation, high rates, and war. That's according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And there's no fucking Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's a fucking crime syndicate run by the bigs. They say the United States and China, they could decelerate. The U.S. economy is forecast to expand just 1.5% in 2024. So when you put 1.5% expansion and you put real inflation into it, it's declining. Okay? Those are the facts. Only, and China, China with their zero COVID policy, we're writing week after week after week after week after week where China's going and why. And again, we reversed our trends. We said that the 20th century was the American century, but the 21st century would be the Chinese century because the business of America has been war and the business of China is business. But when they launched the COVID war on Chinese Lunar New Year, 2020, the year of the rat, and 3 years of zero COVID policy, they destroyed the lives and livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people throughout China. So this thing isn't coming back. So they did it to themselves. Yep. Again, all your data is in your magazine. And again, then you have this war going on, the Israel war. Then you have the Ukraine war. And again, there's reports coming out that Ukraine is now sending missiles and bombs like 3,000 miles into Russia. I warned about this week after week after week. They lost the war. They're going to do a major event, false flag, real, bomb a nuclear plant, something, blame it on Russia, whatever. They're going to get back in the news, and they're going to keep pumping more money into keeping this war going. And this is going to have an effect on the economy. Pending home sales dropped to a record low, even worse than during the financial crisis. The CNBC, they hit the lowest level since the National Association of Realtors began tracking this metric in 2001. And the mortgage rates have come down. They're about 7.3%, but they're still too high. And this is interesting. They noted that home sales priced above $750,000 are increasing. Yep. So the people with dough keep buying. And again, the markets up where I am up here in Kingston, New York, are still very hot. Yep. Sales are down 8.5% from October of last year. The GAO estimated 17 agencies had used an average of only 1/4 or less of the capacity of the headquarters. We're paying this fucking money for these clowns. Look at this shit. 1/4 vacancy occupancy rate. 1/4. Federal agencies spend about $2 billion a year to operate federal office buildings and $5 billion annually to lease privately owned office spaces. $7 billion bucks robbing our fucking money because these scumbags are in charge. Quote, whether you're talking about downtown Boston or Denver or North Virginia, occupancy is down substantially. And this is according to John Fish, chairman of Real Estate Roundtable. No fucking shit. How long have we warned this? It goes back to what no one's talking about, the banking crisis that's going to come. It's going to happen. There's going to be defaults like you've never seen before. Again, here it is. It's global. Property slump hits Renee Benko. The property slump sweeping the globe has claimed the new high-profile victim, Renee Benko, an Austrian-born realtor department store magnate. Benko's main holding company, Signal Holdings, said Wednesday it is filing for insolvency in Austria with its valued property portfolio of nearly $30 billion fucking dollars. U.S. suicides reached a record last year. No shit. We warned about this would happen when they locked down everybody. And this is the fucking language they use. This is why you get the Trends Journal. You go to trendsjournal.com, and here's what they write. The record reflects a broad struggle to help people in mental distress following a pandemic. Now, not a pandemic. 99.93% of the people are still alive. All right? And when you look at the numbers that come out now that they're finally reporting that if you broke your neck and fell off a ladder and broke your neck, but you had COVID, they put you down as COVID rather than a busted neck. So the numbers are even lower. So it wasn't a pandemic, but going on, right? Little fuck faces made this shit up. Stand 6 feet apart. Put on your mask when you walk in a restaurant. Take it off when you sit down. When you walk in an airplane, put on that mask. Take it off when you're eating and drinking, even though people are sitting all around you, because COVID knows when you're eating and drinking. So just do what you're told. They fucked this thing up so bad. Again, going back to China, all things are connected when they launched the COVID war. And again, I believe they did that to stop the protests in Hong Kong. Out of 7.5 million people, over 1 million were taken to the streets. COVID came, can't go protest anymore, can't protest. And again, one of our top trends for 2020 was New World Disorder. There were protests going on everywhere. COVID came, they stopped, and there were protests in Algeria, in Lebanon, in South Africa, in India, in Algeria, all over the world, Colombia, Peru, Chile. Can't go out anymore. I wonder why people are committing suicide. Anyway, check out yesterday's Celente and the Judge.
Section 702 of the FISA Act, which expires this Christmas time, basically removes Fourth Amendment protections to foreign individuals communicating into, out of, or within the United States and the Americans with whom they communicate. How Congress thinks it can suspend the Fourth Amendment for a class of people is beyond me. We'll talk about the theory for a minute. But the practice, what's happening here, how the Republicans, many of your colleagues, many of our friends, have betrayed the Constitution is what I want to discuss. Where does it stand as we speak? The efforts by Republican leadership to reenact, to prevent from expiring this monstrous law.
Judge, first of all, thanks for having me. It's good to be with you. And thanks for your leadership on this issue, because you're an important voice and you need to keep out there vocalizing the pernicious 702. I mean, let's talk about where it stands. That's what you want to know where it stands. So procedurally, we have a bill that we've been putting together that has what I would call the reforms that even the Intel community, the Intel committee agrees we should have. So that's a kind of our base bill that we're working from. And next week, the House Judiciary Committee is going to have a markup. And in that markup, we're going to take that base bill and we're going to put in additional some amendments on there that will protect our constitutional rights more. So things that need to go in there is to have a warrant before the intelligence community or the police apparatus of the federal government can actually query. Now, another word for query is search. But before they can query a U.S. person from a database that they legally obtain by going there, let's just look at it this way. They are looking at people that they're supposed to be looking at, foreign persons or foreign entities who are not in the United States. And when they have that database, and if a U.S. person is encountered in that database, they want to just be able to go in and look at that U.S. person. And we're saying, no, we want a warrant before you can go in there. We want an independent arbiter to adjudicate whether there's reason, which we would call probable cause, to actually even look into that U.S. person.
The Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, protects all persons. It doesn't limit that protection to just Americans. It doesn't limit that protection to just good persons. It doesn't limit that protection to persons that the government likes. It protects everyone. How does the Congress think that by ordinary legislation, not by a constitutional amendment, but by ordinary legislation, it can defy the Fourth Amendment by exempting its protections from a class of people on the basis of where they were born?
There is no even serious argument made right now, Judge, about that. And I'll just tell you why. Is because we're having trouble paring down this law. We're having trouble actually reinventing it and changing the scopes of the parameters so that just U.S. persons, people in the U.S. are protected. And so to move beyond that and say everyone is entitled to Fourth Amendment rights would be that'd be like a bridge too far. We can't even, we're having trouble. I guess what I'm saying, we're having trouble moving incrementally where we need to be moving toward, much less going for a home run or a grand slam here.
I want you to tell me and tell us about the phenomenon of the federal government doing indirectly what it absolutely is prohibited from doing directly by purchasing private communications from custodians of them.
Yeah, that is exactly what's happening. So they will buy from, and it isn't just like companies you've ever even heard of. I mean, like Google's got a massive database, obviously, and others do as well. But there are private vendors that will go in and accumulate data. So let's say that you go to a grocery store, Judge, and you sign up to get their little deal so you can get set specials and sales. Well, now all your information is in there. That information is floating around and gets sold elsewhere. And the federal government and its police alphabet soup of police agencies buy this data, and then they can mine it. As you say, I'll give you an example of one called the Hemisphere Program. So it's not just in FISA. I mean, people need to understand this. This isn't just in FISA and NSA and FBI. You had a group buying in the Hemisphere Program. They were buying data, and then after January 6th, they were using that to try to put people on the Quiet Skies program, which means you're a domestic terrorist, and they're going to take away your right to travel in the U.S., all without any kind of due process, right? So that's called the Hemisphere Program. A report has just come out recently on that, exposing that. So we have to clean that up as well. But this is the weaponization of the government, and what they're doing is what you're talking about is they're essentially making these data brokers as their middlemen, as their agents, and they're claiming that they have the ability then because they're not directly engaged. That's not true, though. The law is very clear on this. You cannot employ someone else to do what the federal government has no right to do, and the case law, I think, is pretty clear on that over time. So that's what they're doing, and we're trying to fight back with this 702 reauthorizations, because the entire FISA thing is not up for reauthorization. It's just 702.
Right.
We're trying to get reforms and attack the entire FISA program as well.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
Might not have an answer for this, but also if I was surely convinced that we need to engage in bioweapons research, why aren't you doing this on the North Pole, the South Pole, like as far from people as possibly imaginable? Like I understand, like all those movies of just, people in a remote area cooking up chemicals that might wipe out the human race. And then you end up with a spill, and then the other scientists got to go down there. And then that's when it leaks. And I can write the science fiction movie for you. But why are they doing this near wet markets, near populations? Like, it just seems really dumb.
Yeah. So there's actually a particular reason for that, for militaristic biological application.
Okay.
So in order to create, have you heard about genome-specific biological weapons?
Oh, dude, I'm dumb. I don't know anything about this.
So RFK Jr. has brought it up, and
if I wanted to just wipe out Asian people, or just wipe out Jews, or just wipe out,
so you can essentially find like a DNA sequence that is only specific to certain nationalities, and you can I guess make it bigger to make it more fine to specifically target people based on region and ethnicity or race, nationality. So in order to do that, you have to study the blood, the DNA of the individuals of that region. So the reason why that the United States has labs in Ukraine as well as Taiwan, they have over 1,600 there are 1,600 labs in Taiwan, and majority of them are funded by the United States, is because they're studying the DNA of the local inhabitants who are
Isn't it easy enough to ship some blood? You tell the people that, I don't know, you partner with some pharmacy every time, or some doctor's office every time they're running a lab test, and you just ship a little bit of blood. Like I would think there's an easier way to get your hands on blood than actually having a lab, in the area.
Yeah, it's not just about volume of blood. It would have to be blood from different individuals. So I guess I'm not a medical guy, so I don't know what it would take in order to get, repeated access to different people's blood from different regions. But
you create a thing called 1-2-3andMe and learn about your ancestors. Yeah, that's what you do. Yeah, or you tell people, hey, you want to start eating a healthier diet? I can tell you the foods that you're allergic to based off your DNA, and people just send it in to you.
Yeah, so actually, Democrat Congressman Jason Crow actually brought up your exact point that 23andMe is actually a nefarious entity that is studying your DNA to develop this information to hand it off to other entities who are looking to. They claim it's for defensive research, but it's really for able to create biological weapons that can delete people based on nationality or ethnicity.
Which makes sense because, like if we went to war with China, you wouldn't want to have to nuke China, because if you really got to nuke China, you're going to be, you're going to create so much massive amounts of pollution on Earth. We're going to have a problem. But I guess if you could, target them with something that only kills people of a certain and no one's comfortable, I guess, even with this concept, because then you're identifying that, I guess, races do have different characteristics. But I can understand, at least if you want to say we're all incredibly different looking but equal in all ways and capacities, you could at least acknowledge that there is I guess slight changes to or enough of a similarity to certain structures of DNA that I mean, it's interesting conceptually, and I understand from a weapon standpoint why, if you could kill off a group of people, like it might be advantageous.
Yeah, from a militaristic standpoint, it's genius. It's probably the greatest weapon anyone's ever created. Say I want to take over a nation, like you said, I can keep all the infrastructure intact and just all the people just die. It's brilliant from, but evil in every single possible way you can imagine.
Right.
But when you're thinking from a militaristic standpoint, say for Russia or China wanted to go to full out all world war, we can remedy the situation rather easily. But as you said, in order to get there, it's dangerous and nefarious and evil in every way.
All right. So what's your prediction for the end of this war? Do you think we're going to continue fighting over there? Do you think we're unwinding? Do you think they work out a peace deal of Putin taking the current territories? Do you think Putin makes more of a push on trying to expose the biolabs? Like, just give us your wild ass prediction of what you're expecting for the next year.
Yeah. So essentially, right now, Ukraine's a war of attrition, and Russia are winning handily. The narrative out there is that it's a stalemate. Russia have established their defensive and fortified positions in eastern Ukraine and cut off Ukraine from getting back into the Donbass and Crimea. So Ukraine are constantly attacking, and they're just losing all their men and losing funding and support worldwide at a rapid pace. So eventually, Russia are completely content sitting where they're at and letting Ukraine continue to just deplete themselves of resources, equipment, weapons, men. So eventually, this is going to come to an end in some sort. The only way that this ends well is if NATO and the West decide not to get into a direct conflict as a result, which it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. It looks like eventually this is going to end. As for how it ends, I couldn't tell you, or when. Russia are totally fine sitting where they're at and letting Ukraine slowly milk themselves to death. And then they're going to take over eastern and southern Ukraine, pretty much the territories they have, and moving. They don't want Western Ukraine. The narrative that Putin's this mass maniac who wants to take over all of Europe, it just, at least from my perspective, doesn't seem to be true.
And
he
so is he even pushing forward anymore, or it's literally they're holding the line and Ukraine keeps charging at them and just dying, and so they're happy to just
they're taking Ukraine. They're taking small areas around like Advika, sorry, I can't pronounce it properly, and they're essentially just fighting off advances from Ukraine right now, who are just running headfirst into odds they can't beat.
Right.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
I'm sure you have read this, but there was a private cable that Julian Assange dumped from Burns, the current CIA director, who was at the time the ambassador to Russia. This was in 2008, and he sent a private cable to Condoleezza Rice, who was at the time the Secretary of State, and it's titled "Niet means Niet."
Exactly.
And the whole thing is about how Ukrainian entry to NATO is the brightest of red lines for everybody in Russia, and they simply will not stand for this. And look, again, it's not reasonable that Vladimir Putin invaded and killed all of these people, but it is totally reasonable to say you cannot expand your military alliance to our biggest next door neighbor. We would never accept that. And we would totally invade. I mean, you think like if the Soviet Union was still around and they said Mexico is a part of the Warsaw Pact, that the Washington D.C. would just go, well, they made their decision.
We're just going to. We almost went to war over missiles in Cuba.
Yeah, right, exactly.
No, you're totally right. And by the way, that Burns memo, which I've read, he doesn't just in my read of it, doesn't just report that this is the Russian position. He validates it. He's like, yeah, you get it. Like that's that's not a crazy position to have. And I just was with Assange in prison, in Belmarsh prison in London, like last week or 2 weeks ago. And, they're torturing him to death, obviously. And I'm thinking to myself, like, why would they, it's what they're doing to him is so cruel. Why would they do that? And it's stuff like that. It's the Burns memo. Because it really laid, if you knew what was really going on, these people would be on their way to prison. And so you can't have Julian Assange's. You can't have anyone who tells the truth because it's too big a threat.
Anyway, so let me ask you just a little bit about this kind of latest conflict. It seems like in the right, and when I say the right, I just mean broadly, like say the right half of America. It seems like there's been this kind of split where 50% of the right stepped into a time machine and is now in 2002. And then there seems to be the other half that I think you are kind of in, where you're still like, hey, but I thought we kind of learned some lessons over the last 20 years. And I thought the whole America First movement was kind of about like, shouldn't our government be primarily concerned with what's best for our country? Can we at least have a conversation maybe before we just give a blank check to level Gaza? And what's this kind of been like for you? We responded on the show to Ben Shapiro kind of really emotionally attacking you over saying like, hey, we have a lot of very serious problems here that don't seem to generate nearly as much concern amongst the political class. Like, what have you thought about this dynamic and this kind of shift in the right in America?
Well, I mean, honestly, there are days when I've tried not to think about it because it's just too revealing. I mean, it's really like walking in on your parents having sex. You want to unsee it, like you shouldn't. There's some things you don't ever want to see, and one of them is people revealing themselves to be totally false, just like deeply dishonest frauds. And there's been a lot of that. Look, so most of my opinions on most things are not very interesting. And I have a million opinions on a million different countries because I've traveled so much over my life. But one thing I've learned is like the closer you get to something, the less you realize you understand it, And so I really am trying to discipline myself to focus on the country that I live in and that my children are living in, which is the US. And so I just from day one, I'm like, I've got all kinds of opinions about a whole suite of different issues and countries, but I want to, for the purposes of my job, like focus on this country. Number one, we have freedom of speech. It's guaranteed in our Constitution. It's the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. And anything that abridges that is not only unconstitutional, it's immoral. And so we just have to stick to that no matter what. I don't care if there's a war, a financial meltdown, or riots in the streets. I get to say what I think because I'm a free man, not a slave. Okay. So anyone who is against that is transactionally my enemy. Okay.
Right.
Number one. Number two, I don't want to get into a war that doesn't benefit us. We've done that a lot over the past 20 years. I've covered all of those wars. I think I can say with certainty we didn't benefit. And by the way, those countries didn't benefit either, for what it's worth. And so I don't want to do it again. Number three, we're not capable of winning a war in a meaningful sense with Iran. If they closed the Straits of Hormuz, we would have a full financial meltdown. Like we'd be poor, like in a day. So the stakes are incredibly high, leaving aside the potential for nuclear conflict. I don't want that. And the fourth thing I want is the ability to like have a conversation about it. For example, on the question of refugees, there are 2.5 million people living in Gaza. Obviously, a lot of people of Israel want them to leave. I get it. Whatever, that's their country. But their argument is these people are too dangerous to live next to us. Okay, that's their view. But then for people to argue that they should come here, wait, I thought you just told us they're too dangerous to live in the place they were born, so they have to come to the United States. What does that say about how you feel about the United States? It tells me that you consider this country, my children's country, a trash bin into which to throw your shit when you're done with it. And I'm so offended by that attitude. I can't even process. Like, it actually makes me red in the face mad. It's so disrespectful to my country that I can barely deal with it. And I have a lot of trouble speaking to, like, people can have their views about, is it justified to kill thousands of civilians? Okay, I'm trying to stay out of it. But nobody can justify that argument that these people are too disgusting and immoral and dangerous to live next to Israel, but they should live in the United States. Fuck you if you're making that argument. And I mean,
100%. One of the things that was really amazing to me was to see when Donald...
Sorry, I lost control. It makes me so mad.
You're absolutely right.
My wife or something. It's so... You don't even like America if you're making that argument.
Well, no, and like you said, like you said, I mean, I have the same attitude. Like my kids are growing up in this country. Yes. So I don't care about the future of this country. I care about it more than I've ever cared about anything else in the world. That's the most important thing, is where my kids are growing up. Like, what life are they going to have? And it's not like there's one or two people making this argument. This is like the establishment of the Republican Party's position.
Some people over the years have taken the position when we put out a message like this that, whoa, dude, that's going too far. You got to show these people some at least respect of the office. That's out of line. But in response to the largest government in history, the entity that claims power over virtually every aspect of our lives, when it's not supposed to be doing that, I mean, they claim the power over what kind of light bulbs we can have, how much water we're going to have in our toilets, what kind of plants we can grow in our own backyard and consume in our home, and what kind of tools we can use for our natural right of self-defense. These people don't deserve respect, in my opinion. But here's James Otis Jr., who put it this way: when our rights are invaded, it is high time to throw aside prudence. And when I think of most of their so-called acts, laws, rules, regulations, and orders that have been on the books, whether it's today or for decades and decades, most of them shouldn't exist. And it reminds me of Thomas Jefferson's great quote: "Law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of the individual." Man, that is absolutely timeless stuff. So how do you deal with that? And surprisingly, I want to cite Alexander Hamilton from Federalist number 33. Of course, he said whatever he needed to say for the audience in front of him to get what he wanted. So he probably wasn't even on board with this. But maybe he certainly was a flip-flopper. But the message is what's important here. He's talking about the Supremacy Clause and points out that acts of the large society which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. The word usurpation is important. This is how the founding generation, the old revolutionaries, described acts that are not authorized or delegated to the government. Arbitrary power, for example. If we think of the grievances, listed grievances in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson in the text actually called them injuries and usurpation. So when they go beyond their limits, we're supposed to treat them as a usurpation of power. Either that means it needs to be resisted or completely disregarded. And when it comes to principles of the American Revolution, there were not too many people who were more influential on the old revolutionaries than a guy named Algernon Sidney. And here's how he put it. That which is not just is not law, and that which is not law ought not to be obeyed. Not only do they deserve to not be obeyed when they go beyond the limits of their delegated powers, they ought not to be obeyed as well. And this mentality was certainly carried forward in the ratification debates over the Constitution in 1787, 1788. James Madison, I think I most prominently highlight from Federalist number 46. He said, how do you deal with a federal government that does unwarrantable stuff, unconstitutional? Or for Madison, even if it does warrantable but unpopular stuff, he recommended a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union for states and individuals. And he said if a bunch of states did the same thing, and again, states doesn't just mean state governments, it's the people comprising those political bodies, those societies. If a bunch of them do this same thing, this refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union would present obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. In other words, the government, without support of the people in the states, is not going to be able to implement its stuff. Or even more aggressive, here's Archibald MacLean in the, I believe, Virginia Ratifying Convention. Do I have that right? Archibald MacLean. I'm just having a little brain fart here. He said, how should we respond to government? I got to look this up. Where did Archibald MacLean come from? Archibald MacLean. Where was he? Archibald MacLean. North Carolina Ratifying Convention. Wow, I should have this down by now, but every now and then I'll screw it up. But here's Archibald MacLean. He's saying, hey, what do we do when they go beyond their limits? How should we respond? And he said, this is what we should do. We should respond to them by saying, you cannot exceed the power prescribed by the Constitution. We will disregard it and punish you for the attempt. So again, when they go beyond their limits, it has to be treated as a usurpation. And like Hamilton was saying in Federalist 33, but also what Sidney was saying. And here's MacLean saying, we're going to disregard it and then go further, punish you for the attempt. St. George Tucker had a similar take in his view of the Constitution of the United States, published in 1803. He said, acts of Congress to be binding must be made pursuant to the Constitution. Otherwise, they are not laws, but a mere nullity, or what is worse, acts of usurpation. So again, usurpation, they are not laws, they're just stuff that they put on paper. But how do you deal with it? He said the people are not only not bound by them, but the several departments and officers of the governments, both federal and state, are bound by oath to oppose them. For being bound by oath to support the Constitution, they must violate that oath whenever they give their sanction by obedience or otherwise to any unconstitutional act of any department of the government. And I can't have a conversation like this without citing Lysander Spooner's great defense, A Defense for Fugitive Slaves in 1850. And here's one part of it. If you haven't read this one yet, you really got to do it. It'll be linked to in the show notes. It's free over at Liberty Fund, and it's got a ton of great strategic advice and insight. But Spooner put it this way. To say that an unconstitutional law must be obeyed until it is repealed is saying that an unconstitutional law is just as obligatory as a constitutional one, for the latter is binding only until it is repealed. He said there would therefore be no difference at all between a constitutional and an unconstitutional law in respect to their binding force, and that would be equivalent to abolishing the Constitution and giving to the government unlimited power. Ultimately, if you continue to comply with stuff that's unconstitutional, and you're waiting for the government to determine if the government violated the rules given to the government by the people of the several states, then government does, as Jefferson put it as well in 1798 in his Kentucky resolutions, that is giving them unlimited power. Benjamin Franklin sums it up best: make yourselves sheep and the wolves will eat you.
And when you think about it, well, would the government ever come along and steal your gold if you were staving gold? Well, they did it already, and a long time ago. People didn't fuss with it. 1933. Roosevelt, as soon as he gets in office, he confiscates the gold at $20 an ounce, and then he revalues at $35 an ounce. And guess who benefited from that markup? The government, so that they could, inflate at will for all the nonsense that they want to get involved with. So it's been going on a long time, and that's why you can't know exactly what will happen. But the governments will not ignore what is happening today, because if people are protecting and actually an answer to the fiat money, the government is not going to like that. So that's a big burden, but it's also part of the system, and it's also part of human nature and how it's been going on for thousands of years, how there are some people who are evil and mischievous, and they'll steal and rob, and the destruction and the manipulation of monetary policy has been known for a long, long time. And so they're going to continue to do that. So, of course, I fight for sound money and getting the government out of the way and make them quit doing the things they are doing. But still, we all should participate in working for a free society with that sound money. The founders gave us sound money, then in the Federal Reserve got to the point where they finally destroyed any semblance of trying to keep our dollar related to gold.
So I personally don't think that America is the same as 1933. There was a lot more trust in government in 1933. Unfortunately, the trust led to a lot of bad things than today. And so they're already taking your dollars. And you may think, no, I go to my bank account and it's the same. I don't see any dollars missing. No, they don't take the amount. But what those dollars buy, now you're buying a lot less, even though you have the same amount. And that's because they're destroying the value of the dollar. So they're already stealing from you right now. So if you're worried about them stealing gold, they can't counterfeit gold. Okay. So there's that. And I also wanted to bring up President Biden, one of his tweets. Of course, politicians never blame themselves. So they have to blame someone else for the inflation. And his tweet was funny. He says, "Let me be clear." And, whenever they start with "let me be clear," get ready because they're about to snow you. So he says, "Let me be clear to any corporation that hasn't brought prices back down, even as inflation has come down. It's time to stop the price gouging. Give Americans consumers a break." Now, this is such deception. Inflation is not down. Inflation is still up. It's just less than several months ago, but it's still rising. Prices are still rising. It's the same as when government spends more one year over the previous year, but if it's a less percentage, they call it a cut. They're cutting and everything is going to fall apart, but they're still spending more. So it's the same thing with inflation. That's how they deceive you. And I feel bad, even though they are on the rotten end of the stick for the businesses that create products, because they have to adapt. Their prices are also rising, and their consumers expect to pay relatively the same thing. So what are they supposed to do? And that's why we see shrinkflation. You see the package gets a little bit smaller, but the price when you go to the store is still the same. So you feel like and they really that's their option, because they can't go to everybody and teach everybody economics and say, this is why we're doing this. We're getting squeezed. We have to stay in business. We have to stay profitable to stay in business. They can't go and explain to everybody, but consumers are still upset, and because you could see it. I see it when I go to the store. You're getting less, but paying the same amount that you did before, but you're getting less. And it's easy to just blame, it's the company. It's the company. And that's what Biden is doing here. He's trying to blame them. But it's the Bidens, it's the Trumps, it's the Obamas, it's all of them that spend trillions and trillions of dollars that they do not have, that the Federal Reserve prints. And that's why the dollar loses its value continually. But they will never point the fingers at themselves, which is where it belongs.
It'll be a hard time to find out what the next unit of account will be, but I'll tell you one thing, history will always defend a unit of account as being gold. They've done it for 5,000 years, and that's what they have to go back to, but it's going to be a rocky road to get back to that. So anyway, I think the monetary system gives you a lot of information. It's fascinating. It tells you a lot about human nature. It also tells you about the very evilness in people that want to have a free ride at the expense of the middle class and the poor, because when you inflate, you're taxing the poor, and the rich are getting richer, and that's why we end up with political chaos, and this bankruptcy has a long way to do before it's over. We're going to do our very best to expose the culprits that have run this and get people to try to get protected the best they can, and in the meantime, it doesn't mean that it's inevitable that we have to live like this forever. If we do the right thing, really, if we did the right thing, there would be some pain with it. And if you just took your hands on it and let people take care of things, it would last about a year. What if you could work and you didn't have any forms to fill out, you didn't have any regulations, you didn't have any taxes to pay? People would go back to work. No welfare, though. People would go back to work. You mean I can go out and work and I don't have to do all this thing? Yeah, it would be pretty nice. So the solution is not difficult, it's not complicated, but it's politically resisted by the powerful elite, and that's where our problem is. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.